So in this presentation, there is 3 steps, okay? We're going to understand the basics of it, and then we're going to experience it. The experience is always more powerful than understanding, okay? I always say you could learn everything there is to know about falling in love, but until you actually fall in love, you realize you didn't know anything. The experience is where the wisdom is, understanding is knowledge, and then we're going to share it, okay? We're going to talk about how to share it. That's step 1. Okay, for 7, nearly 8 years now, I've researched some of the top conscious scientists, spiritual teachers, you name it, truth seekers. I've researched whatever I can get my hand on, and I've found that there is a common link. So even if they disagree, and there's on some topics, they all share the same solution, okay? And that solution is 2 parts. Love, obviously we have to care, okay? It's important that we care about ourselves, our children, our children's children, and this beautiful planet that we live on, and everyone else that lives here. The second part is the power of collective meditation. So, why do they talk about collective meditation, and how does it work? Does anyone know these 2 guys? This is Michelson and Morley, okay? In 1887, there was a spiritual revolution, and there was 2 schools of thought. So on one hand, the people believed that there was a field of energy. They called it the ether presence back then. And they believed that this energy connected everything. And what we felt was put into that field, and it influenced the things around us. The other school of thought believed that if it was there, they could measure it, okay? So they did a very famous experiment called the Michelson-Morley experiment, 1887. And what they did was, they created a piece of equipment which was very good for the time, it was very advanced for the time, and they thought that they would be able to measure the ether presence as it moved through the equipment, okay? But that didn't happen. And Greg Braden, who's an incredible conscious scientist, the way he explained it was, he said, the equivalent of that experiment is if we all wet our finger and put it in the air, and we didn't feel wind, and then from that we said there's no such thing as air, okay? That's how they got the results for this experiment. And it laid a foundation that we've been living in a state of separation. It laid a foundation that we are separate from everything, okay? So we've separated ourselves from our world. We think we can just keep mistreating this planet. We've separated ourselves from each other through race, religion, position. We've separated ourselves from our bodies. We abuse our bodies. And we've separated ourselves from spirit. The good news is, almost 100 years later, they revisited this experiment. And they had far more sophisticated technology. And this is what they found. They found that we are deeply connected through a field. And there's a number of different names, but the scientific community has settled on the field, okay? The field acts as a conduit, okay? So it carries the feelings and emotions we have in the body, it carries them into the field, and then it also acts as a mirror, okay? It mirrors back to you what you're putting out. So I think we've all experienced that. Yeah? In the mornings, if we're late or we're stressed, or we'll spill our coffee, we'll hit every red light because we're in that, yeah? If a fish lives in polluted water, the fish will get sick or will die. This is logic. But we have the ability to purify our environment. So let's look at some science that shows how we can influence the world around us. In experiment 1, what the scientists did, they got what they call pristine DNA. It's from the umbilical cord of a baby. and they placed it within the magnetic field of a human heart. So this was a practitioner that was not linked or at all to the DNA, wasn't related. Now, the Institute of Heart Math, they have measured that the electromagnetic field of the heart goes out about 8 feet outside the body. Okay? Now, they believe it goes way further than that. They believe it goes out into the cosmos, but their equipment can't pick it up. So they say 8 feet outside the body. So the pristine DNA was placed in that field, and the practitioner then embodied positive emotions like love, care, compassion, and then negative emotions like fear, jealousy, anger, and so on. And this is what happened. When the practitioner embodied negative emotions, the DNA began to coil up, okay? It couldn't express itself. And then when the practitioner embodied positive emotions, the DNA lengthened out almost flat and then began to multiply. Individuals trained in feelings of deep love and appreciation were able to intentionally change the shape of the DNA. This was published in 1994 in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. It's a very prestigious peer-reviewed scientific journal. Okay, so experiment 2. In experiment 2, they created a vacuum, okay? And in the vacuum, they then measured light photons, the activity of the light photons, because our reality is made of light photons, okay? And the results were they were acting random, just as they expected. Then again, they introduced the pristine DNA to the vacuum. And what happened was the light photons began to mimic the shape of the pristine DNA. And even when the DNA was removed, it still held that shape for a while afterwards. We are forced to accept the possibility that some new field of energy is being excited by the DNA. This was published in 1995 in Nanobiology, another prestigious scientific journal. So what do we have? Human emotion. In experiment 1, influences human DNA, affects human DNA, and in experiment 2, human DNA affects matter. Therefore, human emotion affects matter if you cut out the middleman. Human emotion produces effects which defy conventional laws of physics. Okay, experiment 3, the double slit experiment. Are you familiar with this? Yeah? So I've heard this explained very complicated and very simple. So I'm going to go with the simple one, okay? They fired particles at this steel plate with 2 slits in it, and then they measured what, on the backboard, they measured the beams of particles that went through, okay? And they did what they expected, okay? They behaved like particles. But when an observer was present, when the experiment was being observed, the beam of electrons behaved like waves. Okay? And this baffled scientists for a long time. Researchers at the Weizmann Institute of Science have now conducted a highly controlled experiment demonstrating how a beam of electrons is affected by the act of being observed. The experiment revealed that the greater the amount of watching, the greater the observer's influence on what actually takes place. And that explains, this is the founder of the movement, Master Sha. One of his one-sentence secrets is, together we have the power to heal the world. Okay? That shows it, that explains it. So what could be the effect of 1.5 billion people and more consciously uniting and creating elevated emotions for the greater good of the planet?